Right. And I think in the interest of time, we should kick off this session. So thank you all who have been able to join. I am hoping that some more people will join in. Today's topic is DevOps fueling open source. And this is an interesting topic because people can actually turn it around and say open source fueling DevOps. So I'm hoping that we build a perspective from here and try to steer this conversation. Of course, it is one of the difficult conversations. Before we initiate any further this dialogue, I also wanted to ensure that you know how to connect. So basically, we have a meetup group in Canada. It has 3 chapters: Ottawa, Edmonton, and Toronto. So if you're curious what Canada DevOps community of practice is doing, I do appreciate you join in and participate and contribute to the initiatives we are running here. We also have the DevOps Summit, which is happening November 8th and 9th. So we welcome you all to join in there. We have a LinkedIn page, which you can follow and see what events are coming up. A few things before we actually get going. I This group which we have created, we crowdsource, ideate, and validate difficult questions around DevOps, open source, and software. We also are trying to set the pace for the next generation software practices. A few of the white papers you can see at the right hand side. So we have generated a lot of momentum and steered a lot of conversations around data ops, no ops, innovate with DevOps, automation to AI. All these are like challenging topics. I think if you are interested, you can know more about it. And we, for today's agenda, we have 2 links. We have the crowd chat, and it is ongoing as we speak. So William is watching that chat. We have already posted some questions in the chat, so we would invite your perspective on those questions. And I am also watching over the chat. The first question is it DevOps fueling open source or open source fueling DevOps? So I would invite our key hosts for today, William, Sriram, Siddharth, and James. Welcome. And let's start this conversation. I would like to ask this question to Sriram. What is your perspective around is DevOps fueling open source or open source fueling DevOps? What is your take on it?
I think in today's software delivery lifecycle, this is how I would see Garima. Both are inevitable. Right. DevOps, having a kind of DevOps culture within your team is also going to be the order of the day, and building open sources and ensuring that you build a community across the globe, right? Breaking those barriers of within the organization or something, right? So those kind of things are also inevitable. So I would see these two things are inevitable at this point of time, that any organization should adopt to in building their software delivery practices. Uh, but very specific to this, I think it's complementing. DevOps is kind of helps organizations to not deliver the softwares in a faster pace. So obviously that would from my perspective, it would be DevOps is fueling open source to it. Right, but at the larger, at the macro level, I think these two are the order of the day in how organizations operate their software delivery teams.
Right. And if you want to get the perspective in the crowd chat, that would be great as well. I also kind of believe the larger conversation is definitely open source, and we all probably agree with it. DevOps has been a channel to steer this open source dimension. And I wanted to bring in Siddharth at this point in time and see from your perspective, Siddharth, because you actually work in a very controlled environment and you have an excellent experience coming from large banking background. So what do you see happening in your context, how you guys are steering it?
See, the question of, and I'll put it in crowd chat also, is whether DevOps is fueling open source or open source is fueling DevOps. Is a similar question which people ask for cloud as well, whether cloud is fueling DevOps or DevOps is fueling the cloud. However, I think is the urge of getting digitization, of urge of staying ahead, or the urge of faster delivery is actually fueling both of these. Uh, if you consider in the banking environment where I work, we don't have that urge of having the open source. However, at the same time, we are not saying that we are not in need of open source. The point is, there are organizations which cannot invest in this high cost proprietary tools and products. And for them, definitely, I would say, how should I put it? So I'll put this in way is open source is becoming good staple for the DevOps world. Yep.
Yeah, I kind of agree to it, and it is a difficult question. So let's move forward in this discussion and see how this discussion is shaping up. Of course, Siddharth, I would like your point of view on the crowd chart as well. So our next question would be that what are the key challenges? I think that will link back to the first question of whether DevOps is fueling open source or both are steering each other in one way or the other. So from a key challenges perspective, and I know that William, you work in a large a data-centric environment. How do you see that the key challenges are kind of considered? And I also wanted to bring this perspective of how uh, is there an unfair advantage of influence in this dimension that when we talk about open source, is it only the big companies who are influencing this move or rise?
A good question, Garima. I think in environment I'm working in at the moment, data-centric, there are many large companies, the typical Microsoft, Amazon, etc., Oracle companies in the picture with a large influence, with a big history with the large corporations. This is, I think it's hard to move. There's a culture within the large corporations of relying on the support, of relying on the guidance and the visions of these large companies, and not being held so responsible for these strategic decisions, because if you can base your vision and future of your IT on the vision of one of these large competitors in the market, you're not creating your own risks. You're going along with the crowd. So I think there's a comfort factor there. I think that's one of the big things in play here is a comfort factor within the large corporations. Some of them are deciding they can go ahead and do things their own way. They're willing to be trailblazers. They're willing to take some risks because they see some advantages for their business. Basically, it comes down to how can you serve your business the best, right? Can you serve your business by creating your own vision and strategy and products with open source, or can you serve your business by taking a more conservative standard approach using the tools from the large companies? That's kind of the take I have at the moment where I am with this data-centric environment.
Right. And I also wanted to highlight that the challenges are twofold, right? The challenges from the companies themselves, the open source projects, open source initiatives. That's one dimension. Like, what are the challenges for them? And why it is challenging to adopt to open source is another conversation. So I again turn back, Sriram, to you. From your perspective, how do you see the challenges building up? And are you kind of seeing the same kind of challenges we see in Canada when it comes to open source?
Uh, No, not really, Garima. When you see it, when you talk about the challenges, right, and one of the point that you mentioned is there an unfair advantage for big cloud companies to influence? I don't think that is no, they do hold an unfair advantage at this point of time, because it is the open source, the community of building open source is still in a nascent stage, I would call, right. It is still not mature state. Certain certain portions of organizations have, our industries have started encouraging it, but it has not been, it is not into full-fledged at this point of time, right. If the big companies starts influencing with their with their unfairly, I think this companies will start, or the delivery teams will start looking to alternate areas to look into, rather than getting budged to the big cloud companies, right. For example, let's take this, right. Irrespective of which cloud you operate upon and all those things, when you talk about open source, the biggest thing that comes up is the GitHub, right. GitHub is the version control tool that where most of the majority of the open sources prefer, communities prefer, irrespective of whether the cloud is going to be Microsoft or Amazon or Google, right. So in that way, I don't think it is no, it's the big companies have an unfair advantage at this point of time. Of course, there are challenges. The challenges I would see more from within the industry, rather than from the this kind of big companies, like the cloud companies or the other thing, who go hold the softwares and licenses, all those things. The industries, be it financial sector or healthcare sector, the promotion of getting into open source as a community or as a culture is still, as I said, still in the very budding stage. And the more the organizations come forward at the at the CXO levels or the leadership level, I know that's another question that you have raised in, but just to touch upon that, the more the organizations come forward, I think it is going to benefit as a whole. So I don't think the big companies have an unfair advantage to influence at this point of time.
Yeah, excellent. And I also wanted to ask Siddharth, because Siddharth, I know that you have been closely associated with open source community and projects recently. So, from the community itself, what do you see? Where are the challenges, and how should we kind of unfold these challenges and steer more participation from the community perspective? What are the key initiatives or key recommendations you have for the open source projects, like from an inside out perspective?
See, one of the important view and unknown view is how much regulated are the open source tools in terms of governance, in terms of compliance, and how stringent they can be. Because what happens in banking and finance, you keep coming up with new laws, new policies in the field of security. So how quickly adaptable those open source tools are. And since this is an open question which does not have much answers, at least for the banking and finance, so people stay away from the open source community. However, what could possibly be done for this is, and this is what I've seen is in few of the organizations, rather than doing going for open source outside the organizations, people are building open source community within the organization. So it is somewhat called as inner open source. So you drive this open source world maybe within your own organizations. For example, what people are doing is uh, they're bringing solutions for the governance piece, how to have, let's say, automated governance within the organizations through the tools that were built by the people within the organization. So on one hand, you are staying away from open source, which is the open source outside organization, and you are trying to build up something which is known as inner open source, which is inside the organization.
Yeah, very interesting. So I actually want to reflect on the licensing of these inner open source solutions. I know that this has been something which is in question, and I think probably there is no one way to go with it. A lot of people have been challenged by this, and some of these open source companies were, open source in the beginning, and they were forced to go into enterprise model just because of the licensing, the liability, and the copyright issues they had. So how, Siddharth, I'm more curious to know about this inner open source community which you're talking about, how the licensing model would work. And I believe that this would be like a closed open source like initiative, but it's kind of still the license, the liability, accountability, and the copyright belongs to that large enterprise. And this is what you're kind of referring to?
Yes, yes, of course. If you look at a couple of organizations, for example, GitHub also, they started these open source world, inner open source. And what they're doing is you build it with a few set of people. And in that case also, you may invite a few people from outside your organization also by invitations. And then you build something. However, at the end of the day, it will be proprietary of the organization which they are owning. And yes, of course, if they wish to, uh, so what possibly could be done is, and is being done is, what they're doing is they are sort of creating the APIs which are
Mhm.
exposed to the outside world. So they're keeping their knowledge, code, everything within the organizations, but few pieces are exposed to the outside world through these API applications.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. And that actually helps us to understand maybe in the future we will have certain different licensing models as well as certain, different initiatives cropping up from where we see, challenges in open source environment. I also kind of acknowledge what you had said, Siddharth, in the beginning that I was working with a large enterprise, and SOX compliance is a big thing there. So if you cannot have an audit trail of the liability and asset and accountability of all the assets in the company, it will be a problem. So I think from that perspective, I also believe that some of these regulatory bodies are also looking at the conversation, a broader conversation on how to embrace open source and how should we have a regulatory which works in the best interest of the community as well as the enterprises. So yeah, I think these are all good points. If you can add it to the chat, that would be great. James, you have been silent since the beginning of the conversation, and I really want to have an outside in perspective in this. How do you see the outside in perspective from what are the key challenges to embrace open source, and how how to ensure that we have a strategy for the risk exposure and the liability accountability which we are kind of embracing with open source?
Sure, I think, yeah, you did touch upon a good point in terms of putting the governance in place when it comes to an enterprise. And this, to a large extent, also stands good with smaller organizations, because we've now recently seen of how the backdoor entries are taking place. So with these open source, in terms of how can you secure the environment, that's going to become more and more relevant, is what my view is. And putting in best practices around governance. When you are using open source, sources, how do you create an environment which is more secure? Is what I would look at. Yeah.
Yeah, security definitely is one of the key components which the entire community is looking at. So let's move forward with the next question. And this is really an interesting one because I wanted myself to understand how the investments are steered in an open source community. I actually invited Vishnu. Unfortunately, he could not join this conversation today because he works in heavily with open source projects, and he might help us understand the investment investment initiatives. But Sriram, if you can actually help us understand the investment ecosystem in US, how do you see that the investors are kind of looking at these open source projects? And if investment is not only through funding, how do we steer continuous investment to sustain an open source project? That is a question at hand. So if you can build some perspective on that, that would be great.
Sure, Garima. See, honestly, this is one of the interesting questions that I too had in my mind, right, and I still continue to have it. How are the investments being stated, and how do they monetize, if at all the contributors are trying to monetize on all those things? How do they do it? So that's still a kind of a question that I still have in my mind. To be honest with you.
Right. So anyone on this chat today has a perspective on, the investments, how they are steered, and what are the key challenges for steering an investment into an open source project? I would like to engage if Siddharth, William, and I also see May joining in.
I can make some brief comments. I'm not so involved with open source actually in where I am now, but I think I can draw some comparisons. If you are engaging with proprietary company, say Amazon, huge company, many customers around the world, and they provide service, but in order to work with their products, you need your own in-house specialist, you need your business relationship manager, you need your legal team, you need investment planning, you need a huge team to work with that company to make sure that the product is put in place and supported and serviced and updated and so on. And I think if you're working with open source, there are parallels, there are different roles, but I think the overall concept is quite similar. You might have some specific roles which are, and maybe some of you can comment on this, you might have some specific roles which are more unique to the open source environment, but I think the framework is very similar. You need your legal team investment, you need many things. There might be more of a focus, some might be a little bit heavier on the open source side and a little heavier on the other side, but the general structure and framework, I think, is quite similar. Can anybody comment on that from their experience?
Yeah, I will actually take this conversation ahead. Siddharth, you wanted to say something?
No, go ahead. I'll add up after you.
So yeah, what I wanted to say about investments, and this is purely based on my experience, and it shows in this discussion as well, that the first point is that we somehow lack the guidance, governance, and support needed towards these open source projects. So that is really evident because between all of us today, we do not have enough answers that how investments are steered. The second part of the conversation is, investment should be sustainable. So whether it should be one time or reoccurring, that's a part that's a part of the conversation as well. So I think that how to get recurring investment in terms of funding and in terms of people are two different aspects of the same problem. So again, as a community contributor, I would say my knowledge is free, but my time is not. So until and unless the open source communities would understand and realize that community contributors are here to learn, grow, have fun, but also to a certain extent we need to ensure that we have a mechanism where open source communities can monetize their contributions, right? So that's something which we lack today, and probably this is a greater conversation or a bigger conversation we need to take as a consortium of partners, that how we will ensure that these community contributors contributions can be monetized, and that will steer continuous investment, not in terms of funding but in terms of time and contribution. So that's every open source project would be looking forward for. And the first part is in itself like how these projects will be funded. So I think the from my experience, I think we have lacked support in bringing these projects to products. So basically how this opens, if there are and there are several open source projects, so how this project becomes a product, there is lack of conversation, dialogue. And I think there are organizations like CD Foundation which is doing an excellent job in trying to steer this conversation in one way or the other. Linux Foundation has done a similar kind of thing, and there are other various organizations. But I think we need to have a structured approach. At least in Canada, we have we need to have that conversation more early and more often. Yes, Siddharth, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I was saying there are ways in which these open source projects are funded. One thing what they do is in their product which they are selling, they add some freelance ads from various companies. So what happens is if you access any apps which are free apps, you will find ads coming into it. So they get funded by those companies. So that is one way of funding. Second way of getting funded is generally these communities. What they do is they tie up with these portals like PayPal and other platforms and get, for example, if you do on Wikipedia also, there are places where you can fund those Wikipedia projects as well. So you may say that if you like this project, if you like this app, if you like this community, please fund this. That is another way. Third way of funding these open sources, these communities, they tie up with couple of organizations and a big companies. So I will not say, I will take just a clue as a Google or a Facebook. What they do is they ask their people if the idea they like is, if their people from Google and Facebook can devote 5 hours, 6 hours, probably let's say once in a fortnight to the open source community. So they don't have to pay also, and the open source community is developed also. The fourth way
Yes.
in which these open source communities are funded is they try to sell an idea to any big companies, and what they do is we will build this XYZ for you, and once this is done, you pay for what we have done for you. So that is how they kickstart these fundings, and they just start building up as and when their product is revised. One of the other ways of funding this open source communities uh, is there is a collegium of various organizations who come up and do something. So what they do is there will be one person from NACWest, one person from Google, one person from Facebook, or another person from XYZ organizations, and they try to build something for the people outside. So I think these are the few ways. I may not be aware of all the ways, but these are the few ways in which this funding happens.
Right, and this is an excellent viewpoint, Siddharth. Thank you for bringing this up. And it leads us to a different question altogether. And I think it will also highlight a few gaps which we have, and we have to ensure that we have a dialogue on those gaps as well. Like, what is that business model shift which we are looking forward for the future, and how licensing for open source DevOps capabilities would be building up? And when we talk about license capabilities, basically there are two types of licenses we kind of talk about most generally: GPL license and MIT license. But I'm more like keen to understand that how, as tech professionals, we see that business model shift. And I'm very curious and anxious to kind of know about how these community contributors, which are basically devoting their time, will be monetizing their their effort and contribution and time into the open source community in a bigger way? Is it something which is a conversation in itself, or it will continue like this? People will come, join, learn, grow, and leave the open source communities. And is this a sustainable way actually for the future? So that's the conversation at hand. And I know that, James, you have a large business background. So how do you see that this even you can connect it to the shared economy discussion which we separately had the other day? How do you see that business model shifting from where we are today, and how open source licensing and these kind of accountability issues which we kind of see from various dimensions will come together, and we can build some capabilities?
So I think at the end of the day, it's all about the monetization. Whether it's in the shared economy or whatever we do in terms of open source, unless we've got a business model which facilitates monetization, it's very difficult to have people come and contribute or share. Like you raised that good point, my knowledge is free, but not my time. Now, a lot of these contributors come into these forums, and when they see that there's no monetization that happens, then they drop out. And that's where the sustainability is a challenge for these communities, in my view.
Yeah, and I think, Sriram, you are on the other side of the border. I would like to also understand from you, how do you see this conversation relevant?
I have a different question, picking the points that you shared and Siddharth and others shared as well, right? See, at this point of time, we clearly know that there is no proper structured investment model that has been followed across organizations, right? The other point that we normally see is open source contributions are more encouraged in startup kind of models rather than a big organization, right? Is the lack of a proper funding investment on monetization model, right, slowing the growth of open source contributions in big organizations? Is that the way to put it? And these startups, if you take them, maturity of startup, at some point of time they join a bigger organization, or they get merged with a like size and like-minded organization, all those things to make it big. So at that point of time, then is where when the organizations become big, is this going to be a challenge in they continuing to be open source contributors?
So I
That
think
is a kind of a question that I get.
Yeah, so Sriram, I think you raise a good point. And if you look at some of or most of the larger organizations, whether it's an IBM or an Enghouse, I'm just referencing few. They've all got an M&A team, and they keep watching out which are these open source, which are these startups which are building up a product or a solution. But where is the monetization? And if they see a monetization model that comes in, and then they go and potentially acquire them. Because that's what's typically that's happening. So yeah, there is a lot of work that's happening in the startup world, specifically around this area. And the larger organizations have their M&A team keeping on prying and looking out for where the model is monetized, and then they walk in and acquire that. Is what I've noticed to a large extent.
Right.
Right.
And when they are being acquired, sorry, Rima, just to add, right? Add to your point, James, I think that's a specific thing that the good point that you guys. But my doubt still that I have is when they are being acquired, right? Those organizations, do they still continue to contribute in the same pace that they were doing before, or is there slowness because of the licensing and all those restrictions that is coming into? And is that going to be a challenge for growing this open source community? So that is the kind of question that still rings my brain.
Yeah, again, it leads to two things once the acquisition takes place. One is, would it get diluted within the larger organization? Because, when they were evaluating how was the monetization model, but when it got absorbed into them, do they still see the profitability within that? The second thing is, sometimes they tend to absorb it so that they don't allow that product to be a competition to them over a period of time. So they absorb it and then they kill it. Let me put it that way, in a probably a very candid way. But yeah, these are two things that we see that sometimes they let it groom over a period of time, and if they see that there's an opportunity to grow and build profitability, they fuel more in terms of that business. Otherwise, they kill it based on it not being a competition for them over a period of time. So yeah, it all depends on people's agenda at the end of the day. Sadly, I'm just being candid on this matter, but acquisitions are not necessarily for growth. Sometimes they're also for people's agenda.
Right, and I think we need to have there is a need to have a transparent conversation around these points. Like, I also feel that if and when we will make sure that every developer, every contributor in that open source community is considered as a sponsor, as an investor, then only we will be able to move forward with these capabilities in an open source kind of a direction. Unlikely, I think, when these large enterprise acquire these open source projects or products. There is a transition period and there is a large learning curve for that big enterprise as well, that how these open source communities are groomed, what is the community behind these projects. And often also, I think there is a very critical question at hand whenever we are actually evaluating open source projects or products to acquire. We also have to have a clear eye on the technical depth of that project, because what I have seen is that a lot of projects have over the time grown their technical depth, and at a certain stage it's just no longer sustainable, and then somehow they found an investor, and then it kind of dissolved in one way or the other. So these are kind of questions which we also need to answer, like how do we ensure that there is no large technical depth in open source communities. And this is again turning back to the same conversation of focused contributors, focused community engagement, and to a certain extent, what is that return of investment which is happening towards the community. So that's a question at hand. One other thing which I also wanted to highlight was when I see these large acquisitions happening, the whole model, the business model shift is kind of not understood well, because you'll have to make people co-founder for these open source engagements. You have to distribute the liability as well as distribute the potential credit coming in. So I think these conversations need to take place if large enterprises need to embrace open source. Any other further comment on this topic, the business model shift, the licensing model
Yes,
shift?
I would like to comment on Siddharth's comment. So the question was, are we coming to terms with the open source with DevOps on the rise? He says, absolutely. It needs to be. Proprietary tools cannot be leveraged all the time by all the businesses. So my question there is, why do some developers choose this route of going for open source, and why do some offer proprietary tools? Why is there not a proprietary solution available for all problems? Why are some only available on the open source and vice versa?
See, how would I put it? That is if your time is, coming back to the earlier statement, if you think your time is not free and you want to get paid for the time that you're investing, definitely you can't make everything available to people who are not paying for something. So, however, what is happening on the new set of business models is, and to answer your question and the discussion that is happening is, the business model is that don't create a product which is a pure open source product, or don't create a product which is a pure proprietary product. How can we have a mix of two? And a good example for this could be, I'm not sure how much have you seen GitLab. So GitLab is how their progress is. The core of GitLab is all about open source. The core structure or framework of GitLab is all about open source. However, the wrapper is their proprietary tool which they have built up. So what they've done is they're not selling it as an open source product or a proprietary product. They're selling it as a GitLab product. However, the core remains uh, the open source communities which are supporting it. So what they're doing is uh, for that same product, if they're selling it to let's say an individual, they're selling it for free. They're selling that same product to the enterprises. They're selling it on a payable basis. If they're selling to some other community, they're doing a mix of lesser cost or higher services. So the point is, yes, it could be probably be done, but you should be aware of what your business model is. Don't try to sell your product just as a pure open source or pure proprietary. You can have a hybrid model as well, where you can have a small chunks of your product piece from open source community and a bigger from your proprietary. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, William, but I was trying to bridge your question with the business model question.
Yes, there are a number of different monetization models, I believe. So, I mean, you have you can offer additional services, your time and expertise to users, or you can offer licensing. So you can offer some type of additional licensing to paying users, which or a premium code, a paid version, where you might have some additional features. You might have additional support and so on. So there's a number of different models you can use. I see that, and I've seen this on the market. For me, it's a bit confusing as to which route to go. If you're a client, what is the best route to go? You have these different models available from different providers. Some of it's open source and you're on your own, and some of it is licensed or paid code. You can adapt it. So there are so many possible routes. And as an IT service provider within your business, it really does require quite a bit of thought and strategy building to decide on which route to go on, because every decision, every route has knock-on effects down the road. So if you are creating your own code within open source and developing your own version, then the support is on you. And maybe the support is on you with the support of an open source community as well. So you're moving away from the proprietary businesses and their licensed support over to I'm doing it myself, but I have this open source community working with me, and I hope they can help me out. So is this a kind of a leap of faith to go into the direction of open source?
It's a very good point, William. Because it also is a point where the open source projects and these products which are kind of building up should focus on. And from coming from a large and complex enterprise, I can tell you what I look for when I outsource or I source in any of the products. What is the support model? How the support model works? What is the documentation of the product? Can I kind of figure out what is going around in this project? I also think that it's also important to understand the technical depth, as I mentioned, and to understand clearly the OpEx for the open source. Like, do you need investment internally from the organization to build the perspective on support, on customer facing engagement, and what is the liability you kind of carry forward, because you will be cascading that open source product liability into different other product domains and dimensions. So we having a clear view on that would also be a very important factor in making a sourcing decision. So all in all, I think we at least I would research a little bit more on the framework, on how an open source framework kind of at a high level can support these kind of business decisions which large enterprises are making. And Siddharth, I know that you initiated this conversation, so you would have much more than what I had uh, put forward. So if you also have some additions, just let us know.
Sure.
Yeah, one more point actually before we move forward. I think in some of the regulated industries like telecommunication, banking, healthcare, there are standards and regulatory bodies which are kind of having, they have worked for several years to put forward these kind of standard compliance regulatory, I would say, guidelines. And it is equally important that we ensure whatever open source capabilities which we are bringing in have complied to these regulatory bodies. Specifically, I can talk about, let's say, telecommunication. It has been a conversations at least since 10 years now to have an open ecosystem of radio network, and it's just starting up right now because it's a difficult thing to do with so many proprietary licenses, modeling, and monetization, businesses, how they monetize their proprietary software. So it's a very, very difficult conversation. Yeah, Siddharth, you have shared a case study from GitLab. That's excellent. I will also kind of highlight that Google also has a lot of applications and tools which are open source, Chrome being one of them. So Chrome, the basic, the framework is with Google. So it's some of the basic components are proprietary to Google. And then we have an advantage of actually accessing whatever base code they have to develop browser base. And if you see, Microsoft has also embraced that open source thinking with Edge browser, and they have actually taken up Google Chrome to enhance their browsers. So that's another a good example.
I guess it's probably like the freemium world where you give it free for personal use, these open source tools, and like what Siddharth mentioned, when you get it into the enterprise, you charge them slightly. But because people are more comfortable using at their personal level, so when they join the enterprise, they form a group together and they said, why not we use this particular tool? And that's probably something that fuels these sort of organizations to a large extent. And you can see that in the previous years in the hospitality industry, Fidelio was a very common tool, and people used to always hire people who knew Fidelio. Or if you look at Apple, the way it structured its whole organization, they sowed the seeds with iPods with children, and then they got accustomed to using the Apple iPhone, then the iPad. So it's something similar which is building up. Probably give them free for some time, and then when they get into enterprise, they start using those tools at a paid version.
Yeah, okay. So I think these are excellent points, James. And I hope that when we come out with a white paper, we can refer a few of these cases in the white paper. Now, we are 10 minutes left in this conversation. I think I will move to the last question. Key advice to CXOs who are looking to return of investment from the open source ecosystem. And let's start from, let's say, Sriram. How do you feel that if we have appropriate advice at this point in time with the conversation which we had to the CXOs?
My perspective will be very simple. The open source community is going to stay, right? The culture of open sourcing, the products that we build is going to stay in this small software delivery world, right? So CXOs have to encourage that, right? That's the only way that I see forward in this particular topic, right? I think CXOs have to encourage their teams come and make a lot of their products open source, and that would be the one particular point to start with, where they can start investing and monetizing it, right? So building in the business angle towards onto the technical part of it would definitely help in to see how the open source community can monetize their investments and their efforts, and it is going to be a balance, and it's going to be a win-win situation for all.
Yeah, excellent. Any other points from any of you? Maybe Siddharth, you can extend this with your own vision around, uh, how investment into open source ecosystem would benefit, or at least we can get the return of investment.
First and foremost is, which is pretty obvious, is support in all due respect these communities to mushroom. First and foremost, I know the pressure on, let's say, the venture capitalists, the organizations on making a return on their investments would be high, but at least support these communities. Point one. Point two is, whatever money you are making out of these models, invest back into that same model, which is another thing. What happened is, we churn out some money from them, but we don't invest back to it. So two things which is very critical, and why I'm actually saying is, I have seen this in some organization. I've seen people are not fueling these communities. So it's like, you're not investing that in a small plant to becoming a big tree, and you are expecting fruits from it right at the day one, which cannot happen. And second thing is, if you're getting fruits out of that tree, ensure that whatever you're selling it, you're giving back some nutritions back to that tree. So two simple things that people or any organization should follow.
Right, and I also want to extend a few more thoughts to where I have seen communities going ahead and doing wonderful job. Is there are two different aspects of the same problem. The first problem is, of course, these big enterprises would like to manage their exposure to risk, right? So knowing your risk and managing the exposure is critical when you are investing in an open source project. Also, from a CXO point of view, if you are looking for return of investment, do not overlook the OPEX. Do not try to kind of overlook the dimension of support, technical debt, documentation, investment through your own community. These are kind of aspects which will be critical when you are looking at benefits, right? The second aspect, as Siddharth mentioned, was giving back to the community. Nothing comes free in this world, so you should be able to give back and try to get more focused contributors. How would that happen? It's still a question mark, because the incentive model for these open source communities are not clearly defined. And this is something which we could do it through the conversations which we are having right now. I would ensure that all this dialogue will be put forward as a white paper. And I think we will have to have some more conversations on this topic, because I feel that we all require some support in understanding, where we are going with open source. How should we contribute in this, and what is our responsibility to ensure we have a framework that everybody kind of, gets return of investment, not only big companies, right? Any final
Right.
words?
And, Garima, I think you touched on some good points there. I think there are some non-obvious ways of monetization, and maybe non-direct ways of monetization of your contribution. One thing that just came to mind during our conversation here, developers. You're a developer working on a problem, and you see the community is out there working on similar issues. If you put in a lot of time and effort, it may solve your one problem, but it may also solve the problem for many other people out there with the similar problem. So you can become like a superstar developer. You can develop your reputation, and you can leverage that. So this is not a direct way of monetization, but within this open source community, you can develop your reputation. you can start speaking engagements, training sessions, and possibly other ways of monetizing your contribution and your reputation. So I think there are probably other indirect ways. So maybe the model is not always so obvious.
Right, very good point, William. And I think we are into the last minutes of this chat. I clearly see that we have a large potential here to begin another round of conversation, and I would like all of you to be part of those conversations. My agenda would be to kind of drive from where we are today to a more structured framework kind of an approach, not only towards investments, funding, but also how we steer focused contributors from the communities. Like Canada Community of Practice is one good example. We have come together with so many initiatives and events, and it's our time to kind of bring this together, a community of practice for open source projects. And how we will enable these open source projects is something which is a question at hand. And I believe that we have a large potential of opportunity in the pipeline. So again, I would like some final reflections from the crowd chat, William, before we close today's session. So can you just finally highlight a few of the points from the crowd chat?
Yes, today actually people were a lot more vocal than in previous times where they were writing many contributions. So Mark Peters did pop in for a while. I don't know if he's still around. He made a comment, good software fuels DevOps. If the software is internal, you don't need open source, however. So I thought that was a nice perspective. He also said limiting to IT, well, so in the topic earlier was what are the key challenges about cloud companies have an unfair advantage. Said limiting to IT may be an anti-pattern. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. Maybe we should think on that for our next round. Technology is a component in business strategy. So yeah, let's always bring it back to the return on investment and what is IT doing with open source or proprietary code to support the business. I think these are the key questions, no matter what the question is around IT. So pass back to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for great reflections from the chat. And to close this conversation for today, first of all, I would like to thank you all for joining today and giving your time to the community and having this difficult conversation which we had today. I'm really thrilled that we kind of had some conclusions from this. Again, the community of practice initiative is to set some directions towards these conversations. So I will be writing a white paper. So if anyone wants to join in and collaborate to write this white paper with me, please do send me a note, and you can become a collaborator to write the white paper. And I think from what we are seeing here, a consensus is that we should have similar conversations in the future. So I will set up some other events where we can discuss more particular focused questions and topics, and I will bring some more participants from the industry